Hi, Smart News. We're watching a big developing story in the Middle East this week, the most significant fighting in years between Israel and its neighbors. I'm using that term neighbors specifically for a reason. It's a key part to understanding what's happening in the region and why it matters. As I was reflecting on what Smarter News can actually add to the coverage on this story, I arrived at a really simple spot. We need to review some of the basics, the basic components of this story. These basics that are critical for understanding what we're seeing in these new headlines, but that often get pushed aside in the rush for news coverage. That said, we have to remind ourselves that the area that we're covering and the people involved really date back to the beginning of modern time. So that's a lot to cover. And I'm going to use really broad strokes, not to oversimplify or disrespect in any way, but just to provide a little foundation underneath your feet. So when you see a new headline, you have a bit more context. So let's get started. We're going to go to one of my favorite places, a map. This is the nation of Israel. It's the only Jewish nation in the entire world, which makes it different, especially in the Middle East, where most of the countries are Muslim. Israel was established in the late 1940s, and many, including myself, are going to use the term the Jewish state. But just remember, Israel is a nation, a full functioning country, albeit a new country and a small country. It's about the size of New Jersey. You can drive from one side to the other in just a few hours. And there are roughly about 9 million Israelis, which is approximately the size of New York City. Israel is a major ally of the United States. That is important to note. The U.S. supplies Israel with money, military equipment, and other supports. America also provides aid to Palestinians, either directly or indirectly through the United Nations. And there are those that want the U.S. to recognize a sovereign state of Palestine. The United States has decided not to do that as of yet. It is a matter of debate. And for more on all of this, let's go back to the maps. Israel's neighbors include the West Bank to the east, not to be confusing, but the West Bank is to the east, and Gaza is to the west. Both are Arab Muslim areas. Palestinians live in both places. So you can be a Palestinian who lives in Gaza, which roughly has about 2 million people, or a Palestinian that lives in the West Bank, which also has a little bit more than 2 million people. There is an important difference to note, though, about these two areas. The government in Gaza is run by Hamas. A separate group, the Palestinian Authority, runs the West Bank. And these two groups don't necessarily get along. At least they don't get along right now. So the leadership in these two areas are different, but the people that live in these two areas are referred to similarly as Palestinians. How did we arrive at this modern map? Well, we could go back to the 1940s, and the UN drew a line and said, this is the Jewish state and this is the Palestinian state. And really conflict has erupted since that point on. And there's been a lot of dispute about the territory, about the land. And it's easy to look at the map and say, well, this is the Jewish area and these are the Muslim areas. But that's a bit of an oversimplification, because there are Palestinians who live in Israel, and there are Jewish Israelis who live in the West Bank in a place called settlements. And so there is coexistence amid the conflict. And you see that coexistence on our next map. We're going to go to Jerusalem, a holy city for the world's three major religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And you can see that really in the old city of Jerusalem, a part of the city that's been around for centuries, where in a matter of a few steps, you can move from a Jewish area to a Muslim area to a Christian area. And it is amazing. It is life-changing to be there and see these different cultures and different religions in very, very close proximity. There was a war in the late 1960s, and to some, Israel won that war and has the right to its current territory as well as Jerusalem. To others, Israel does not have right to the territory and does not have right to Jerusalem and is instead an occupying force. You see, the United States recognizes Israel as a nation, but others don't. Others like Hamas, remember the group that runs Gaza? Hamas doesn't recognize Israel as a nation. And when we're talking about airstrikes, Israeli airstrikes in a certain area, or rockets being fired into Israel, we're mostly talking about Gaza, at least in this current news cycle. One thing you should know is that back in 1997, the United States designated Hamas, the group that runs Gaza, a terrorist organization. That designation has maintained through Republican and Democrat administrations, although some don't agree with that. Some don't view Hamas as a terrorist organization like America and believe that Hamas is a fully functioning government in Gaza, providing resources and fighting for the rights of their people. That is not the official stance of the United States nor Israel. And this is where a lot of the conflict is concentrated right now. So when you hear a term like Palestinian militants, I heard that in the news today, the journalist should actually be a lot more specific, depending on the situation that they're covering. If there's an exchange of fire between Gaza and Israel, then it is important to note that Hamas, that runs Gaza, is a designated terrorist organization by the United States. And taking it one step further, the United States has designated Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism because it's believed that Iran is funneling resources and weapons to terrorist groups like Hamas. So we could also describe Hamas as Iranian-backed militants or an Iranian-backed terrorist group. And that gives you a little bit more of an idea of how this story quickly moves from a local story to a broader regional story. Now, someone can be supportive of the Palestinian position and not supportive of a terrorist organization. In fact, there are Jewish Israelis who are sympathetic of the Palestinian position, but don't condone Hamas. But the connection between Hamas and Iran is important because it's not an opinion. This is an official designation by the U.S. government. Hamas and Iran share a goal, which is the destruction of the Jewish state. To some, they read that as a desire for more territory, for more land. For others, like those who have experienced the Holocaust, it's a more serious threat. And this is why the tensions can rise so quickly. So yes, the fighting that we're seeing right now between Israelis and Palestinians is some of the most deadly, violent fighting that we've seen in years. Who started it? How did it all start? That's a harder question to answer because it depends if you go back a couple days, a couple weeks, or further than that. But overall, the immediate conflict was about territory and it was about access. The other issue is these bigger players involved as well. It's not just about the Israelis and the Palestinians. You have the United States as an ally of Israel. You have Iran as a backer of Hamas. And you can see how quickly a conflict can escalate in this region and become something much bigger. And we simply don't know what's going to happen next. We just brushed the surface. We could pull on the threads of this story, any of them, and talk for hours. And I look forward to talking to you about the different angles, different points of view in this particular story, in this part of the world. One final thought, there's a lot of people that are caught in the middle. We like to talk about political affiliations, different religious groups, ways to organize what could be a chaotic situation, but you can't forget the innocent people that are simply caught in the middle. And they don't get a lot of the coverage. And so we can't forget them in reporting this story as well. So more to come on this. Questions and comments, let me know. And as always, more on smarternews.com.